Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're concentrating on John Keats and in particular the shortest of his 5 odes, entitled Ode on Melancholy. Before I go any further, I'd love to remind you to join my tribe by hitting subscribe for all things English, literary and grammatical. So let's get into it. Now, it's said that across that summer and autumn of 1819 that Keats wrote 5 of his most famous works, the Ode collections, and that he was reading a text lent to him by his friend Charles Browne that was written by Robert Burton way back in 1621, entitled Anatomy of Melancholy, an encyclopedia really of causes, symptoms and cures for melancholy, attributed largely to love and religion. Now, Keats doesn't agree with Burton's ideas and in fact chooses to write a praise poem on melancholy. And it's important for us to understand that melancholy here is the subject of the ode, and it's not something to be lamented in and of itself. Keats rejects the historic arguments that melancholy in and of itself is a bad thing. And I think it's important that I give you a bit of a background to what others before him believed about melancholy. Let's start off with medieval medicine. In that historic time frame, there were 4 humours, and in particular, one pathological condition that needed treatment was melancholy, and in particular, it was associated with having an excess of black bile. And that meant you had a bad temper, you were motivelessly angry, you were of a dark and brooding disposition, frankly, you were an unsociable person to be around. That was the association of melancholy, and it needed a cure. Now, if I fast forward to the Renaissance, there's a different semantic shift around melancholy that's less about science and more about fashion. It's crafted sadness. If I were to give you a glimpse of what this looked like, someone who was melancholic had a tendency to be pensive in these times, they would say, sensitive, if you like, creative. And melancholy, if in touch with it, could really fuel someone. Now, Keats's argument is more in line with the Renaissance thinking than the medieval, but ultimately he believes that those who can't taste melancholy can't also taste joy, because you have to live life to the full and experience what it offers you, good, bad or ugly. This is an argument that we need to unpack, because he doesn't just offer us the problem, but he does try and encourage us didactically as readers to follow his advice. So let's see how he structures that as we get into it. So first things first, we go straight into the action with this real direct advice imploring us as readers not to go to the river of forgetfulness. That's the ancient Greek myth river Lethe. Now, before I go any further, this whole stanza is all about what we shouldn't do to try and escape or reject suffering as a thing. And that's created throughout this stanza with the anaphoric repetition stressing no, no or nor across this stanza. It's also important for me to note at this point that this was not the original opening stanza of the poem, but Keats chose this abrupt start that goes straight into the action because it forces us straight into the middle of, if you like, in media res, this sense of frantic thought process from our poetic voice. And across this stanza, we're shown a number of natural images that in many ways are associated with death, associated with poison, and each of them in turn offers us actually a transformational opportunity to see this slightly bleak thing in a more hopeful light. We're urged in line 2 that we shouldn't be twisting wolfsbane, which is a plant that used to have numbing qualities if used mildly on wounds. But actually, if you took too much of it, it could kill you, hence the reference to poisonous wine. It's interesting that across just 2 lines, from line 2 to line 4, we're offered again another reference to ruby grape, which in some respects could well be offering us, whether it's poisonous wine or ruby grape, that alcohol is not an escape either. But then we're also offered the image of the nightshade, another toxic plant if eaten. And then we're offered this idea of Proserpine, who some of you may know as Persephone. This is another ancient Greek character of mythological reference, of course. She's the goddess of fertility and growth. She's very important to farmers, therefore, but essentially she is kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld, and her dad is Zeus, her mum is Demeter, and her mum is devastated when she's taken to the underworld. And she was allegedly so sad that all the plants on earth died. Now, the argument for why this is in this poem is potentially because the compromise is that Proserpine spares half of her year on earth, bringing the sunlight and summer with her, hence the season of summer, and then spends half of the year in the underworld. And so in a sense, that reference could be offering us exactly what Keats is suggesting, that there is in fact a transformative opportunity in the wilderness that is the dark times or the anguish cause of suffering. But then on saying that, we're then told, make not your rosary of yew berries. And a yew berry looks a bit like this. It's also got poisonous qualities. The rosary is that bead that religious Christians could pray over. Nor let the beetle. Now, for ancient Egyptians, the beetle had sacred qualities. Okay, Khepri, the god of the rising sun, was the association of the scarab beetle, and the transformation of that new life was said to be brought in when you place scarab beetles into a tomb, and that's where you used to place beetles. I'm sure that Keats is playing on that fact because it was led to ancient Egyptians anyway believing in reincarnation and the like. But then the death moth. Now, the only reason I think this is in here is actually it's called the death moth, not because it is associated with death, but because anatomically it's fascinating to look at. It looks like a skull. Don't allow it to be your mournful Psyche. Now, Psyche obviously means mind, but in ancient Greek mythology, Psyche was also the lover of Cupid, but she has quite a strange arrangement in the marriage. When Aphrodite, Cupid's mother, sets them up, she says that Psyche must not look on her husband. Now, she chooses to do that, and alas, she has to fulfill all these difficult obstacles to be seen as an equal to Cupid. Now, the gods intervene again, but the mournful nature of Psyche is that she does suffer. She does suffer because she disobeyed one of the gods. So the mournful Psyche is this unfairness, the injustice of it all. Nor the downy owl, again a reference to an animal associated with death. So, but the owl is not your partner in sorrow's mysteries. Instead, we're told, unlike other romantics, dare I say it, like Coleridge, that drugs are not a solution, for shade to shade will come too drowsily. That implies that you shouldn't be escaping in any sense, whether that's through drugs, whether that's through alcohol, whether that's through just mindlessly choosing to wallow in your own sorrow. We're urged instead to drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. So if you like, stay awake, see it for what it is. I think it's at this moment I should draw your attention to the rhyme scheme. This stanza functions to show us the argument, and the major argument is that reject the oblivion of death. There is hope. And the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E. And the rhyme scheme at points is quite forced. If I were to draw your attention to soul and owl, it's forced. But the iambic pentameter meter that runs throughout this ode is wonderful because it mirrors the heartbeat and passion that lies beneath the message that Keats is offering us. So on lots of levels, this stanza sets the tone. Listen, reader, you need to not feel sad. You need to experience it and experience beneath it what it offers you. Stanza 2 gives us practical advice now of what we should do when sadness hits, or more poetic from Keats, when the melancholy fits or fall. We're bombarded even with a sensory explosion of literary devices that in particular force us to see taste. And the devouring of experience seems to be the dominant imagery across this stanza. I want to draw your attention to the second line of stanza 2, to draw your attention to the simile, heaven like a weeping cloud. It's this idea that melancholy can mask the true beauty of what could be heaven because we only see the weeping cloud in front of it. And then this idea that fosters the droop-headed flowers. Nature is dying quickly because it doesn't get the nourishment it needs and hides the green hill in an April shroud. So that's got several different interpretations. You can't see what's glorious because it's hidden. But the shroud of April, well, April showers, is that some sort of weird pathetic fallacy reference to, rain that just never stops, never relents? Or is the word shroud more significant because of its ambiguous meanings? On the one hand, it describes the fog that's linked to April, or is it rather linked to funerals, with the cloth that's used over a dead body? Both definitely signal those depressing undertones that Keats is very pertinently weaving together. In some respects, this stanza is all about how our need in that moment when sadness hits is to feed our sorrow on beauty. But the question remains, why? Why should we do this? We're told to cling closer to images of, the rainbow, of the salt sand wave, of the morning rose, of globed peonies. All of these natural references on some level are fleeting. The flowers will soon wilt. The rainbow only lasts a few seconds. So should we then be recognising that beauty and sadness abound? I just want to throw you back to stanza 1, the reference to the beetle, the reference to the death moth. In some respects, they represent transformation, a new hope. But then we're given another subset of ways to practically manage sadness when it hits in the final lines of stanza 2. Or, if thy mistress some rich anger shows. So if your partner is mad with you, just hold her hand and let her shout. Let her rave. Wow, that's an imperative mood if ever I heard it. Just let your lover shout at you. And now what was glut thy sorrow, which seems quite indulgent. Now in that final line, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. There's something about devouring and tasting across this stanza, but in particular, the assonance of that final line, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes, it's heavy. This is not about nourishment. This is about some sort of strange indulgence. And there's an awareness here that somehow beauty and sadness, they need each other. But this stanza offers the antithesis, to value life and experience. But we're left thinking, so what? What next? Don't worry, Keats is about to explain. So the final stanza reintroduces us to the woman we just met, the mistress, and we learn she dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. Wow, what an imperative mood if ever I heard it. She will grow old and die is what we're told. It's interesting that we're not told she's beautiful. Beauty here is personified, hence the capitalisation of the abstract noun, and across this stanza we're shown a huge number of personified abstract nouns, and I'll get to those in a moment. But we're told that she dwells with beauty, and I think that verb dwells is significant, because you can dwell with someone and then they can no longer dwell with you. It's like it lives with her for now, but it will fade. And in that same sense of fatality, beauty that must die, we learn that these are transient things. All of the abstract nouns that we encounter here are transient. Whether that's beauty, joy, pleasure, delight, melancholy, they all exist in this state of impermanence. They don't last long enough. Whether it's joy, who we're told is ever at his lips, bidding adieu, blowing kisses and saying goodbye. Whether it's the aching pleasure that's nearby, that's as if the bee is drinking the poisonous nectar, pleasure that can be both good and bad. Whether it's the nature of dwelling even in the most joyful moments of the temple of delight, and that metaphor, you could be in the most wonderful state, and then hidden amongst it all, you will find, capitalised of course, the goddess that is melancholy in her own holy place. So melancholy now is a goddess. And it's interesting, there's so much imagery here again of tasting and decadence. It's all about the ways in which we sense and encounter. More so, we get that with the way that the victim is the taster. We find in the final line that melancholy will empty them like a trophy. But there's so much more to this stanza than that. It's this ongoing sense and bombardment of all these images we've encountered before. For example, the poison that pleasure takes. It's a revisit of the poison that was in line 2 of Wolfsbane from stanza 1. So these things that were poisonous are now in direct, heady mix with each other. Equally, we've got the encounter of what happens there. Though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. Now there's 2 interpretations to this. We've got the associations of the ruby grape of Proserpine or Persephone earlier in stanza 1. But then we've got the shift. It becomes the grape of joy. And on some significant level, it's interesting for me to introduce to you that at this moment in the poem, there's a shift in the rhyme scheme from what goes on in stanzas 1 and 2. That specific line that talks about can burst joy's grape against his palate fine is the line which switches the rhyme order. And it's interesting because critics have argued that this line is talking about sexual anticlimax and the frustration around that. And bursting joy's grape is the disappointment that comes after sexual pleasure. Fascinating. But here, pleasure is intermingled with pain and sorrow, and it's not to say that it's flippant, but it's said to be inevitable in the way Keats sees this. But why set this out? Why end this poem with these contradicting ideas of death and life, oblivion and experience? I guess I have more questions left for you, and I'd love for you to use the comment section below to share your views. Why is it that the person who has the greatest capacity for joy is most open to melancholy in Keats's view? In this poem, is there a resolution? And ultimately, where is Keats in this poem? I think it's fascinating that in this final stanza, he offers us all these abstract, personified nouns that signal the transience of so many emotions. But we're left without any deep understanding of exactly what he thinks of his own personal experience. Is that a step too far for a poetic voice who we know experienced deep melancholy across his life? And there's more to come on that in future videos. Please comment down below, and thank you.